Hello and welcome to Strangers in a Straight Land, a podcast of queer spoken word. When I was trying to think today of what I would talk about, or looking at the poems I wanted to read for you all, I couldn't help but think the first two episodes have already been a little depressing, which is not to be unexpected considering my history and kind of the fact that poetry is the way by which I've processed a lot of the hard and bad things that have happened to me in my life. So I wanted to find some way to be a little bit more positive today. And that got me thinking kind of to our current situations, both in the world with COVID-19 and the lockdown, as well as some of the events in the U.S. recently with the storming of the Capitol. And I think a lot of people are experiencing, maybe for the first time, a lot of anxiety, depression, stress, isolation, a lot of feelings that a lot of people who lead relatively normal lives may experience, of course, but not on this scale or at this frequency. And that's kind of what separates a depressive disorder from just feeling depression is, everybody can feel depression or be sad at times, but when you have an actual mental health issue with depression or a depressive disorder, it's more about the frequency, the continual, unstoppable feelings. And I think a lot of people are experiencing that just due to the length of this crisis and the length by which they've been stuck in their houses. And I think maybe for the first time, a lot of you are experiencing what people with depression have to experience in their lives on the regular. So with that, I thought maybe I'd talk a little bit about one poem that was very special to me in my life and the way I kind of think about depression and joy, and then a couple poems that are a little bit about a similar topic to what the first poem I'll talk about is. I should also note right away that when I say I want to kind of go on a more positive note this time, when I think of talking about positive topics or in reference to hard times, that doesn't mean ignoring the sadness or not talking about it. In fact, I think that's one of the problems that can make it worse, or one of the ways that can make it worse. I think especially in North American culture, a lot of people can get caught in spirals of sadness because there's this perception that happiness has to be a binary. You're either happy or you're sad. And, those two things cancel each other out. You're either one or the other. I talked about this a little bit in the last episode, I think, when I was talking about a woman in the Bible study who kind of had this perception of if you actually love Jesus or, you're a real Christian, you wouldn't be sad. Depressed people just don't believe enough. And I think that's actually the heart of that kind of false thinking, is that to those people, happiness and sadness are binaries. You can't be one with the other. They are separate in every sense of the term. But I do not think that's accurate. And in fact, hopefully this first poem I'm going to read to you, which is by John Keats, not by me. John Keats is a famous Victorian-era poet who tragically died quite young in his life from tuberculosis, along with most of his family. In fact, the poem I'm going to read today, he wrote right after his brother had died of tuberculosis in 1918. And it would only be 2 years later, in 1920, when John Keats himself developed serious complications of tuberculosis and died. Now, throughout his life, John dealt with depression, likely due to the death of many family members and loss. And you would think that the sadness of that, the overwhelmingness of that, and with kind of the knowledge even that you yourself were likely to die of this family disease as they thought of it, it would make you quite hopeless. And when he wrote this poem, Ode on Melancholy, one might assume that would be the voice of it, but that's not the case. So I'm going to read it for you now, and then we'll talk about it, because it is in some older English, so for some it might not be as accessible. Ode on Melancholy, John Keats. No, no, go not to Lethe. Neither twist wolfsbane tight-rooted for its poisonous wine, nor suffer thy pale forehead to be kissed by nightshade, ruby grape of Proserpine. Make not your rosary of yew-berries, nor let the beetle nor the death-moth be your mournful Psyche, nor the downy owl a partner in your sorrow's mysteries, for shade to shade will come too drowsily, and drown the wakeful anguish of the soul. But when the melancholy fit shall fall, sudden from heaven like a weeping cloud that fosters the droop-headed flowers all, and hides the green hill in an April shroud, then glut thy sorrow on a morning rose, or on the rainbow of the salt sand wave, or on the wealth of globed peonies, or if thy mistress some rich anger shows, imprison her soft hand, and let her rave, and feed deep, deep upon her peerless eyes. She dwells with beauty, beauty that must die, and joy, whose hand is ever at his lips bidding adieu, and aching pleasure nigh, turning to poison while the bee-mouth sips. Aye, in the very temple of delight, veiled melancholy has her sovereign shrine, though seen of none save him whose strenuous tongue can burst joy's grape against his palate fine. His soul shall taste the sadness of her might, and be among her cloudy trophies hung. Now, I know for many of you that might not have made a lot of sense because it's in some quite esoteric language, but I'll break it down for you. And in the simplest terms, poem's in 3 parts by each of the 3 stanzas. And the first one, quite simple, aside from the floweriness of the language, when Keats basically says, don't kill yourself. And he starts that by saying, no, no, go not to Lethe. Now, that's a reference to one of the rivers in the underworld. He uses a lot of Greek mythology imagery in this. And he says, neither twist wolf's bane for its poisonous wine, or suffer your pale forehead to be kissed by nightshade. Those are both highly poisonous plants. So he's basically saying, don't drink poison to kill yourself. And he goes on with more imagery along that same line. And he calls nightshade the ruby grape of Proserpine. Proserpine is another name for Persephone, who is the Greek goddess of the underworld. And he also references in this the death moth or the downy owl. These are both traditional images of the soul in romantic poetry. But in basically the first stanza, he's extolling the reader to not give up, to not kill yourself, to not let the melancholy overwhelm you to that point. And then in the second stanza, he kind of moves through that into kind of an explanation of how you can get through this melancholy fit, he calls it. So when the melancholy fit shall fall, sudden from heaven like a weeping cloud. And those of you who may experience clinical depression may understand how often, like an unexpected rainstorm, it can appear out of nowhere and for seemingly no reason. But when it falls upon you, instead of killing yourself, as he mentions in the last stanza, he tells the reader to glut thy sorrow on a morning rose, or on the rainbow of a salt sand wave, or on the wealth of globed peonies. Peonies, one of my favorite flowers, by the way. So he's basically saying, you need to fill thy sorrow, glut thy sorrow. You have to feed it, feed that sadness that has fallen upon you by appreciating beauty of the world, a rose, rainbow over the ocean, peonies in your garden. He says, if thy mistress some rich anger shows, imprison her soft hand and let her rave. So if melancholy, the first time he's now talking about melancholy like your mistress, this woman, your partner in a way. If she's raging, if she's going off, just have to hold her hand and let it happen and write it out in a way. And he says, and feed deep, deep upon her peerless eyes, which is a really fascinating way to think about it. It's almost as you, the person experiencing the melancholy or the sadness, can disassociate from it, hold its hand and let it happen, let it rave, let it experience itself, and also appreciate it. It's like this image of you feeding deeply upon their eyes, looking into their eyes, understanding your melancholy in a way. And why would you do that, you might ask? Sadness is so bad. Well, he goes on in the third stanza to talk about why. And he says, she, now of course melancholy, who he just personified as your mistress, she dwells with beauty, beauty that must die, and joy whose hand is ever at his lips, bidding adieu and aching pleasure nigh. As he's already started as well, too, with the reference to Persephone and the fact that melancholy is a weeping cloud from heaven, there's a lot of deific imagery here, that melancholy is almost like a goddess herself. And that's what he continues in this last stanza. In fact, he says, she dwells with beauty, beauty itself. Melancholy and beauty live together because it's beauty that must die. This idea that all things end, of course, beauty fades. And with joy, whose hand is ever at his lips, he says, bidding adieu, that joy itself also lives with melancholy, because joy is leaving. Joy is temporary. It comes and goes. And aching pleasure nigh. Once again, it's like this juxtaposition he's creating here of pleasure, but it's aching pleasure, almost as like pleasure and pain. The duality of nature, the yin and yang of happiness and of melancholy and joy is this picture he's setting up. And then the last part of this third stanza, he says, I, in the very temple of delight, veiled melancholy has her sovereign shrine, though seen of none save him whose strenuous tongue can burst joy's grape against his palate fine. So from just alluding to the fact that melancholy is a goddess, he says it straight out, that her temple, she shares with delight, that happiness and melancholy share their temple, and that's where her sovereign shrine is. But the only people who can see that, he says, though seen of none save him, whose strenuous tongue can burst joy's grape against his palate fine, that only the people who can fully experience joy, in a sense, that can take joy, burst the grape like a wine, and experience the full aspects of it, and perhaps in a way also tying in with the idea that joy is fading. Only that person who understands joy can see that melancholy lives in the same place. And his soul shall taste the sadness of her might, and be among her cloudy trophies hung. So you can see how Keats is kind of creating this idea that, of course, joy and sadness are one and the same. They live together. They are aspects of one goddess, almost in a way. That you can't truly, in many ways, appreciate and understand joy and beauty and pleasure without understanding melancholy. Without contrast, how do you understand the goodness of something if you don't understand how it could not be? Which I think is a pretty simple metaphor and something that we probably understand and don't think about much. So that's why I find this poem so beautiful in many ways, because for a man who had more reason than many of us to be tragically, tragically sad, the loss of siblings and parents and family members extended to this terrible disease in the late 1700s, early 1800s that had no cure, tuberculosis or consumption. He had every right to be in despair, to see no hope for life. And yet, when he writes a poem about depression, about melancholy, he sees instead the beauty of it, that it's personified like this goddess, your mistress, your partner, your lover, in some of the language and the ways he talks about it. This thing that is with you and is a part of you, and it requires appreciation and understanding. And when it happens, to not let it overwhelm you, but also to let it happen, to appreciate it for what it is, and at the same time take pleasure in the simple things of life, like a morning rose or salt and sand wave, he says. And after, in a sense, maybe it's gone, because there is kind of a temporal nature of the poem, that it's like the initial hit, the really bad feelings of feeling suicidal. Once that passes, then he can talk about it, and from a more, you can get through it, just appreciate small things and appreciate the feeling. And in the last stanza, you're past that moment, and now we can appreciate its purpose in a more philosophical sense. So in the third stanza, we can look back upon it and understand, once sorrow or melancholy has passed, that it has an important place in our lives in many ways. That it is what makes joy even more joyful. It makes beauty more appreciative. It makes every good feeling in many ways have meaning and purpose. And for that, we should appreciate it and set it in its place of honor as it should be, even though obviously in the first two stanzas, it's quite hard to go through. So with that kind of feeling, that's for a long time how I've kind of tried to view my personal experience, my depression, sadness, the trauma of my childhood, because it's real and it exists. It's a part of me. And, there's times when you fear you'll never get away from it, or that it will forever affect how you can live your life or be, or it'll forever force you to be a child or never be able to be a whole person. And trying to ignore it or deny it or bury it is not going to change that fact. And I think Keats' way of viewing sadness in that sense is beautiful, because it allows you to appreciate it, see it for what it is, not deny the fact that it is hard or sad or that it feels overwhelming at times, but that it has its place. And once it's gone, It allows people who have gone through really hard trauma or very dark things in their lives to experience moments of joy at a level of appreciation that people who live maybe normal or more normal lives may never experience, that somebody who has never really experienced true hardship can't really understand the joy they have. And I think we understand that even through things like wealth, why money is such an evil, because it creates comfortable lives where people don't have a lot of struggle and they have a lot of privilege. And the more privilege you have, the harder it is for you to understand both your own happiness and maybe why people are caught in cycles of forever trying to find more money, more things, more joy to feel more, because joy starts to become dry maybe or meaningless without hardship, but also not to understand people who are in tragic circumstances as much. So maybe all this, what he's talking about, plays into that kind of maybe broader cultural aspect as well. So for the last two poems I'm going to read today, they're my own. One of the recurrent themes of my poetry that I find comes out a lot is imagery of the home. But home very much in the sense of like an old home, or homes that are broken down or forgotten or abandoned, kind of this idea of like the empty home, which I think for me often represents the sadness of childhood in many ways, that, you know, my adolescence was quite difficult and I had to leave many things. And so it feels to me empty and sad, like a haunted house in ways, maybe not that dramatic, but, you know, just abandoned and empty. And so you can look back on it both with happiness, because obviously when you were a child, home was a happy place. That was where all your joys were. And then it's weird and it's hard sometimes to then be an adult and look back and also have to look at that image, which for most people should be happy. A childhood should be full of joy, to feel that to be empty or sad. And so that's kind of a recurrent theme I think that comes up with my poems. So I'm going to read two of those that kind of have that idea today. And the first one is called Homegrown. Clovers spring from happiness, sown into the ground, in narrow side yard pathways, in planters overgrown with rose and lavender and peony, amidst forgotten gardens paved in stone. Clovers grow as years unfold, awake trilobal heads in verdant groves of malachite, conjured by the breath of home that inhaled the lives of countless progeny, who tilled the earth with grubby fingers. Clovers flourish in homes abandoned, where fences rot and fall, and dust becomes their red brick walls, and cobwebs haunt their aching halls, where respirations cease, the breath expels, forgotten memories like perspirations flow, and grounds once plowed by tiny hands erupt in clover. Now, I wrote this poem, I think in 2014, when I was living in Santa Cruz, California, and there was a coffee shop. I always like to go to coffee shops to write poetry on Saturday. You know, it's like a nice way to get out of the house and go do something and be intentional about time. And I used to go to this one called the Windmill Cafe in Santa Cruz, and it's this cute little house. So it was like an actual residential house that was turned into a small coffee shop right by the ocean. And I was just sitting in a table writing and looking out the side window, and the side of this house, which has now become a coffee shop, you know, still kind of looks very much older and you know, in that kind of like nice dilapidated way, that like hipster dilapidated way. And outside the window, the side yard was full of clovers, just packed with clovers. And there was a sign in the backyard that said homegrown. And then I think it was listing like produce, like homegrown something for sale or something like that. And that's what kind of inspired this poem. It just awaked that idea of almost like it's an archaeology dig, finding these little aspects of a home and then thinking about this home and what family might have used to live there and what they would have thought of it, and now that it's empty of their lives and something else and it's no longer a home. And that's what kind of talked about that poem. And I loved the clovers too, because when I was a kid, our first house we had clovers all over the side yard, and I used to love them. They were really, really small clover too. Those like really micro clovers. So they look almost like just matte green when you're a little bit far away. And the closer you get, you can see all the little clovers, and I used to love them so much. So that's what kind of inspired this poem, when I talk about maybe the idea that those clovers are kind of like the childhood joy, that even when you have this home that's sad in the sense that it's empty and life has ended and joy has ended, as all things do, there's still traces of the joy from childhood that are sneaking through even this kind of sad, empty imagery of the house. And the clovers really represented that verdant life, you know. And I love this idea that it's children, little kids digging in the ground outside of the house are, the clovers they're kind of like their legacy. They're coming from that joy, like that childhood joy put back into the earth and now growing out, even though this house is kind of sad and empty. And I talk about the house, it's like it's empty in the sense that I say dust becomes the red brick walls and cobwebs haunt its aching halls. This idea that it's empty and shell-like, but these tiny little memories still exist and they still represent the happiness that once lived there. Kind of a short poem, and just, I think, a happy one that touches on the idea that we talked about already, that joy and melancholy are kind of intertwined and inseparable. And even when things end, because all things have to end, children grow up and they leave, and parents sell the houses and move out, and houses that were once loved by people eventually get bought by someone who turns them into an adorable little hipster cafe. Something about the spirit of that family, or the joy, or the childhoods, or the lives that were in it still exist somehow, and I liked that idea. So I'll read it again for you. Homegrown. Clovers spring from happiness sown into the ground. In narrow side-yard pathways, in planters overgrown with rose and lavender and peony, amidst forgotten gardens paved in stone. Clovers grow as years unfold, awake trilobal heads in verdant groves of malachite, conjured by the breath of home that inhaled the lives of countless progeny who tilled the earth with grubby fingers. Clovers flourish in homes abandoned, where fences rot and fall, and dust becomes their red brick walls, and cobwebs haunt their aching halls, where respirations cease, the breath expels. Forgotten memories like perspirations flow, and grounds once plowed by tiny hands erupt in clover. The last poem I'm going to read today is on a similar topic in terms of that it explores the idea of home kind of personified, the home as a thing, not just a place. And I think this one dips a little bit more into my experience of trying to deal with the idea that childhood is a place of both joy and sadness. And for me, quite extreme sadness in many parts. And it's difficult when your home was supposed to be the place of safety and good memories or belonging, acceptance, those kind of things, to look back and to have so many sad or scary emotions, feelings, memories around it, and to rectify that. And I think a lot of people actually experience this too in other ways, especially people who are abused, say, by family members. I think this is a quite common experience for people when maybe somebody who had an alcoholic father who abused them. It's very difficult because you have all this pain and suffering, but at the same time, it's your family, it's your father, and there's going to be often good memories as well. And it's very hard to hold those both in your minds, because we as humans, I think, need a lot of absolutism to make clear the world. And so it's much easier to say everything was bad, that person was bad, and everything they did was bad, and to just ignore or disbelieve that any good could have happened, which is one way of dealing with that often. And it may be for many people what they have to do. But it's at some point, sometimes we have to address the fact, especially for some people who maybe reconcile with their parents later in life. This is an experience of a lot of queer people who come out to their family and get kicked out or rejected or abused in other ways, that then later in life that family maybe reassesses how they view things, and because of that family member who came out, they eventually come to change their thinking or perspective about it and maybe try to reconcile that relationship. Well, for the queer child, it's not easy to just switch back. I mean, you love your family, they're very, very close, and then you feel this rejection and loss, and like you're rejected and lost in the wilderness, and then it's easy for many to start feeling resentful and to just cut off their family. And that's what many have to do sometimes for their own safety and their own happiness, is just to cut off family and be their own person for a while. But hopefully, sometimes things come around and eventually parents and children can come back together and relearn how to have a relationship. And it's hard because those who have been abused have to reconcile the hurt and the pain and the goodness and joy, and that both existed together. And that as children, their parents may have failed them in some ways, but their parents also provided joy and happiness in other ways. And that's a reality, and that's what happened. And it doesn't make the pain or the abuse okay, but you also don't have to feel guilty for appreciating the goodness or the joy as well. Anyway, it's a long way to say that it's a very difficult situation that many queer people have to face. Unfortunately, less than we would like, because a lot of the time there is no reconciliations and parents never come back. But even those people have to deal with this idea that goodness and evil can coexist together. And that's another reason I think that a lot of people who struggle with depression or melancholy or other trauma or difficulties in their life tend to be more empathetic people, because I think we understand more clearly that people are not so black and white in their lives, that people are not all good or all evil, because people we know and we love have hurt us. And often we still have to love those people, even though they hurt us, sometimes in very, very strong and unforgivable ways. And not everyone can do that. It's an impossible task, it seems like sometimes. And everybody's experience is different, so I don't want to generalize too much. But hopefully I'm making it clear for some people who maybe have not had to experience the fact that coming out to your family, I don't know, I talked to some straight people who think it's like, oh, it's not that big a deal. Or modern times, everybody's so accepting, it can't be that hard now. But they don't realize that, well, one, it still is, that kids are still kicked out of their houses, that queer teens are still at much higher risk for suicide and homelessness and substance abuse and a lot of the other problems that come along with childhood trauma and rejection. This is still the reality. It still exists. Even liberal, quote unquote, families who should be accepting or understanding can not be. And sometimes that's just because it's something, maybe a difficult process for parents to have to shift their expectations of their thoughts of what they thought your life should be or who you would be or, what they expected to happen. And there's some kind of understandable maybe difficulty of them or, process of time period for them to have to shift their thinking, even if they're supportive and loving. And that's still hard for the child, even if that's understandable and not necessarily them trying to hurt you. It's still difficult. So for many queer people, it's a difficult place. It's a hard thing to have to deal with yourself, inside yourself and with your family, with maybe community or friends. And it often takes some years of healing for us to come to grips with that and to accept the reality that happiness and pain can live so tightly, closely together, not only just philosophically, but within people that are a part of our lives, that are our family, that we love. And so this last poem is very short, but it is really about that in many ways. So I'll read it now. Home. A home is where the tears still flow, flowing down the house we know. A home would weep into our eyes and show us what our tears once smiled for. The house, the home, in wood and bone where griefs and joy entwine. The past is here, foretold until the house is gone, and home our eyes with tears will fill. So it's a very short poem. Hopefully you can see how that's very much tied to what I was just talking about. And I like the imagery. It's one of my favorite poems I think I've ever written. It was in the first book I published. It talks about home in this past tense, of course. So this is very much looking back. So there's still that idea of childhood. And the author here, or the person speaking, which is of course me, is looking back upon their childhood in a way. And that's why it's in the past tense. And I say, a home is where the tears still flow, flowing down the house we know. A home would weep into our eyes and show us what our tears once smiled for. So in this sense, the house is also, or the home, looking back at childhood, it's also the personification of the sadness of that. I often do this kind of dissociation in my poetry where the reader is looking at something separate from it. And I'm doing that here, so the reader or the speaker is saying a home is where the tears still flow. So you're looking back about this home that's crying for you almost, or it's the personification of that sadness. And I add in a little caveat here that I'm saying it's flowing down the house we know. So separating now immediately here the idea of a home and the house. From the old song, a house is not a home, that those are two different things. The house is the physical thing, but a home is a more spiritual or social, emotional thing. right after that. So I say, flowing down the house we know. So the house is crying. The home is crying its tears through the house. And then I say, a home would weep into our eyes and show us what our tears once smiled for. So the home, or this idea of home as a child or in the past, it's weeping into our eyes. It's giving us the ability to cry or to experience this old grief. It's instructing that for us and showing us, I say, what our tears once smiled for. So I'm also immediately adding in that juxtaposition, the twist, that tears are not just tears of sadness, but tears of joy. And then the house, the home in wood and bone. So again, going back to that idea that the house is not a home, and it's in wood and in bone. So it's both the physical nature of the house, but it's also in bone, in people, in us, where griefs and joy entwine. So happiness and sadness, once again, living together. They're entwined. They're inseparable. And then the last little bit, I say, the past is here, foretold until the house is gone, and home our eyes with tears will fill. I recognize the fact that the home is the past in that sentence, and I say it's foretold until. So once again, I love the opposites of this poem. So it's the past, but it's being foretold as the future. And almost as if our past predicts everything into our future until the house is gone, I say. And home our eyes with tears will fill. So the physical place, the maybe the more temporal place is gone. And then that's when home, or this idea of safety or happiness, whatever home means to you, home is what allows us to cry and to experience the joy and the sadness of that memory. So this poem is very much kind of about processing past the happiness and the sadness and the ending of things, and appreciating all aspects of that thing, and then and then processing that in an honest way. So I'll just read it one last time. Home. A home is where the tears still flow, flowing down the house we know. A home would weep into our eyes and show us what our tears once smiled for. The house, the home, in wood and bone, where griefs and joy entwine. The past is here, foretold until the house is gone, and home our eyes with tears will fill. Thanks for joining me today for Strangers in a Straight Land. As always, all the poems I read today will be available on the podcast as well if you want to listen to them again, and we'll see you next time.